Ad hominem fallacy. Ever been in an argument and felt like something just wasn't quite right? Like the other person wasn't actually responding to your point, but instead making it personal? You're not imagining things. What you're likely noticing is a classic ad hominem fallacy. Sounds fancy, but it's really not. Ad hominem is just a Latin term that means to the person. In arguments, it refers to when someone attacks you instead of addressing your actual argument. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine you're talking about how a new local park would benefit the community. You've got facts, stats, maybe even a nice sketch. But instead of someone replying with a reasoned counterpoint like, "I think the cost is too high," they say something like, "You're just a tree-hugging hippie who doesn't understand real-world problems." See what happened? They didn't address your argument at all. They just went after you. That's an ad hominem attack. It's like you're trying to build a house of logic, and instead of critiquing the structure, someone throws mud at the builder. These attacks are meant to distract you, to throw you off your game. They shift attention away from the argument and toward your character. It's a way to win an argument without actually having to make a solid point. And ad hominems come in many flavors. Sometimes it's obvious name-calling. Other times it's subtle, maybe bringing up your past, questioning your intelligence, or pointing out a personal flaw. The goal is always the same. Make you look bad so your argument loses credibility by association. So why do people do it? Sometimes it's because they don't have a good rebuttal. Other times, they're trying to deflect attention or provoke you. And sometimes, let's be honest, it's just plain mean. But here's the key thing to remember. Ad hominem attacks don't prove anything. If someone calls you a name or mocks your background, that doesn't make your argument wrong. It just means they're not engaging in honest debate. How do you deal with it? Stay calm. Don't take the bait. You can say something like, "I'd appreciate it if we could focus on the argument instead of making it personal." Or, "Attacking me doesn't address the issue. Can we stay on topic?" And if they keep it up, walk away. You don't have to waste your time on people who aren't interested in respectful conversation. Recognizing an ad hominem fallacy is like having a superpower. Once you know what it looks like, you'll see it everywhere, on social media, in debates, in politics, even in everyday chats. And when you can spot it, you can steer the conversation back to what really matters, the actual ideas. So next time someone tries to attack you instead of your argument, just smile and remember, they're not winning the debate. They're just showing they've got nothing better to say. And you're way too sharp to fall for that. Slippery slope fallacy. Let's talk about the slippery slope fallacy. Imagine this conversation. You're worried about rising gas prices, and someone responds with, "If we let gas prices go up now, next thing you know we'll all be riding horses to work. Then no one will be able to afford food, and society will collapse." Whoa, hold on. How did we jump from gas prices to the collapse of civilization? That, my friends, is a textbook slippery slope fallacy. It happens when someone argues that a small first step will inevitably lead to a chain of increasingly extreme consequences, without showing how each step actually leads to the next. It's like saying, if A happens, then B will definitely happen, then C, D, all the way to Z, where Z is always something catastrophic. Let's look at another example. Suppose there's a debate about school uniforms. Someone says, if we let students wear uniforms, they'll lose their individuality. Then they'll become mindless robots. And eventually, we'll live in a totalitarian state. See how they leap from uniforms to totalitarianism? They skipped all the steps in between and assumed one thing would automatically lead to another. That's the slippery slope. People often use this fallacy to stir up fear and resistance to change. It paints even small, reasonable decisions as dangerous, shutting down the conversation before it really starts. The focus turns to exaggerated worst-case scenarios instead of real, balanced outcomes. So why do people fall into this trap? Sometimes, it's out of genuine fear, worry about unknown consequences. Other times, it's a deliberate tactic to manipulate others by blowing risks out of proportion. Either way, It oversimplifies complex issues and assumes we have no control once a decision is made. But reality is more nuanced. Decisions don't happen in a vacuum, and outcomes aren't set in stone. There are always other factors at play. Just because one thing happens doesn't mean it'll start a domino effect. How to spot a slippery slope. Look for arguments that escalate quickly without explaining the in-between. Watch for words like inevitably, automatically, or always. These often signal that someone's making this kind of leap. And if you hear one, call it out, respectfully. You could say, I understand your concern, but I'm not sure how allowing school uniforms inevitably leads to a totalitarian state. Can you walk me through that logic? Or, I think that might be an exaggeration. Let's look at the actual evidence instead of assuming the worst-case scenario. By challenging slippery slope arguments, you're helping keep the conversation grounded and rational. You're focusing on what's likely, not just what's scary. Because just one step doesn't always lead to disaster. And recognizing that makes all the difference in creating smarter, more balanced decisions. Division fallacy. The division fallacy happens when someone assumes that what's true of a whole must also be true of its individual parts. It's essentially the flip side of the composition fallacy, which assumes what's true of the parts must be true of the whole. Even though it's the opposite, it's just as misleading. Let's break it down with a simple analogy. Imagine someone says, "This cake tastes terrible, so the ingredients used in it must all be terrible too." That's a division fallacy. Just because the final product isn't great doesn't mean each component is to blame. Maybe the ingredients were fine, but the baking process went wrong. Here's a more real-world example. This company is known for making unreliable products. So this specific product from them must be unreliable. That's flawed reasoning. Even if the company has a poor track record, it's possible they've made a few high-quality items. The overall reputation doesn't automatically apply to every individual product. Another example. This team is awful, so every player on it must be awful too. But again, that doesn't follow. A team can perform poorly overall while still having some very talented players. You can't fairly judge an individual based solely on the performance of the group. Why do people fall for it? Oversimplification. It's easier to generalize from the group than to examine each part individually. Bias. Negative views of the whole can unfairly influence how we see the parts. Convenience. It allows for sweeping judgments without doing the hard work of looking deeper. The issue with the division fallacy is that it ignores individuality. It assumes sameness where there may be none, leading to unfair judgments and inaccurate conclusions. How to spot it? Watch out for arguments that say or imply, because the whole is X, the parts must be X too. Ask yourself, does this claim overlook individual differences? Could the parts be different from the whole in some way? If you catch someone using a division fallacy, gently challenge it. For example, I get that the company has a bad reputation, but that doesn't automatically mean this specific product is bad. Let's evaluate it on its own merits. The team may be struggling, but that doesn't mean this player isn't skilled. We should look at their individual performance. By spotting and questioning division fallacies, you can promote fairer reasoning, better decision-making, and more thoughtful discussions. Strawman fallacy. Imagine you're in a conversation about healthy eating and you say, "I think we should eat more vegetables." Then someone replies, "Oh, so you think we should all become rabbits and eat nothing but lettuce?" Wait, what? That's not what you said at all. You've just run into a classic strawman argument. Here's how it works. Instead of addressing your actual point, the other person creates a distorted, exaggerated version of it, a straw man, and attacks that instead. It's easier to tear down a flimsy imitation than deal with a real argument. Let's take another example. Suppose you advocate for stricter regulations on factory pollution to protect the environment and public health. Someone counters with, "Oh, so you want to shut down all factories and destroy the economy?" Again, that's not what you said. But by twisting your words, they've built a false version of your argument that's easier to dismiss. Strawman arguments often rely on exaggeration, oversimplification, or taking words out of context. It's like pulling out one brick from a building and claiming the whole structure is flawed. Why does this happen? Sometimes it's a deliberate tactic, used to win an argument without engaging with the real issues. Other times, it's unintentional, a misunderstanding, or careless listening. Either way, the result is the same. Your actual argument gets ignored. So how do you deal with a strawman? Recognize it. If someone's response doesn't reflect what you actually said, you might be facing a strawman. Call it out politely. Try saying, "That's not what I said. I'm not suggesting we become rabbits, just that we eat more vegetables." Or, "I'm not calling for shutting down all factories, just for better pollution controls." Clarify your position. Make your argument clearer by stating both what you do mean and what you don't. That makes it harder for others to twist your words. Remember, using a strawman is a sign of weak reasoning. If someone has to distort your argument to attack it, it usually means they don't have a strong response to the real thing. By spotting and addressing strawman fallacies, you help steer the conversation back to the real issues, leading to more honest, respectful, and productive discussions. No true Scotsman fallacy. Ever heard someone say, "No real fan would think that," or "No true believer would ever say that"? These kinds of statements are designed to shut down debate, not encourage it. That's the trick behind the no true Scotsman fallacy. Here's how it works. Someone makes a broad generalization, but when presented with evidence that contradicts it, instead of reconsidering their statement, they move the goalposts. They redefine who belongs to the group to exclude the contradictory example. Essentially, they're saying, if you disagree, then you're not a real member of the group. But disagreement doesn't automatically disqualify someone from belonging to a group. Let's break it down with a classic example. Person A: all Scotsmen love haggis. Person B: well, my friend is Scottish and he doesn't like haggis. Person A: but no true Scotsman dislikes haggis. See what happened? Instead of admitting their statement was too broad, Person A excluded your friend from being a real Scotsman. That's the fallacy. Here's another example. Someone says, all real Christians are against abortion. You point out that some Christians support abortion rights. They respond, well, then they're not true Christians. Again, they're redefining the group to dismiss evidence they don't like. That's not honest reasoning. It's just dodging criticism. Thinking face, why do people use this fallacy? There are a few common reasons. To protect their beliefs from criticism. If evidence threatens their worldview, they redefine terms to keep their belief intact. To create an in-group and out-group. By deciding who is a true member, they control the narrative and exclude those who differ. To avoid admitting they were wrong. It's easier to shift definitions than to face uncomfortable truths. Magnifying glass tilted left, how to spot it. Watch for phrases like no true group or real group would never. Arguments where the definition of a group suddenly changes to avoid contradictory evidence. Group identity being used as a shield to deflect valid points. White heavy check mark, how to respond. If you catch this fallacy, you can politely say something like, I understand that you believe all Scotsmen love haggis, but redefining what a true Scotsman is doesn't change the fact that some Scots do not. Or, you may believe all real Christians oppose abortion, but that doesn't address the reality that some Christians support abortion rights. Changing the definition doesn't erase the evidence. Direct hit final thought. Don't let anyone twist definitions to avoid dealing with facts. By recognizing the no true Scotsman fallacy, you can keep the conversation grounded in reality. It's not about who counts as a member of a group. It's about the actual evidence and ideas being discussed. Call out these fallacies gently, and you'll help steer the conversation toward honesty, inclusivity, and deeper understanding. Appeal to authority fallacy. Ever heard someone say, well, my doctor said it, so it must be true, or this celebrity uses it, so it has to be good? While it's natural to look to experts or public figures for guidance, relying on their authority alone can sometimes lead us astray. That's where the appeal to authority fallacy comes in. This fallacy occurs when someone argues that a claim must be true simply because an authority figure said so, without providing any supporting evidence. It's essentially saying, "Trust me, because this person said it," even if that person's expertise isn't relevant or their opinion lacks backing. Let's break it down with a few examples. A celebrity endorses a weight loss product, saying, "This helped me lose weight, so it'll work for you too." But fame doesn't equal medical expertise. The celebrity might be getting paid to promote the product or could have used other methods to achieve their results. Their personal story doesn't count as universal proof. A politician cites a famous physicist to support a climate change policy. While the scientist might be brilliant in their field, being an expert in physics doesn't automatically make them qualified in climate science. The authority's relevance is key. Why do people fall for this? Convenience. It's easier to accept an expert's opinion than to research the topic ourselves. Trust. We naturally place trust in authority figures, especially if they seem knowledgeable. Manipulation. Sometimes people invoke well-known names to give their argument more weight, even if it's misleading. The real issue. The problem with this fallacy is that it sidesteps the need for evidence. Just because someone is an expert or appears to be one, doesn't mean they're always right. Experts can have biases, make mistakes, or speak outside their field of expertise. How to spot the appeal to authority fallacy? Is the argument relying only on an authority's opinion? Is the authority actually an expert in the relevant field? Is there any independent evidence to support the claim? How to respond? If you notice someone falling into this fallacy, gently point it out. You might say, "I understand that your doctor recommended this, but is there scientific evidence to support it?" That scientist is a respected physicist, but does their expertise apply to climate science? By learning to recognize and challenge appeals to authority, you encourage more rational, evidence-based conversations. Remember, even experts can be wrong. It's better to base beliefs on evidence and reasoning, not just reputations or titles. Appeal to accomplishment fallacy. Ever had someone try to shut down a debate by pointing to their achievements? Like, "I've done this big thing, so I must be right." That's a sneaky move known as the appeal to accomplishment. It's when someone leans on their past success to claim authority, even if their current argument doesn't actually hold up. Here's how it plays out. Imagine a famous athlete weighing in on complex economic policy. They might say, "I've won multiple championships, so I know what I'm talking about." Now sure, winning championships shows discipline and skill, but it doesn't make them an expert in economics. They're using achievements in one area to claim credibility in a completely different one. Or take a successful businessperson talking about social issues. They might say, "I built a successful company, so my views on society are correct." Running a business takes talent, no doubt. But that doesn't mean their opinions on social dynamics are inherently right. Again, the accomplishment is being used to shortcut the actual conversation. So why do people do this? Sometimes it's to avoid the hard work of backing up their argument with evidence. Other times, it's a subtle way to assert dominance or project expertise where none really exists. The real issue? It shifts focus away from the substance of the argument. When we accept claims just because the speaker has a glowing resume, we risk letting flawed ideas slide through. It shuts down meaningful dialogue and creates a false sense of authority. To spot this fallacy, look for people who bring up past achievements when the topic at hand has nothing to do with them. Are they dodging the actual issue? Ask yourself, is their accomplishment truly relevant to what's being discussed? If you notice it happening, call it out, respectfully. You could say, "I respect your success as an athlete, but that doesn't necessarily make you an expert on economic policy. Let's focus on the policy itself." Or, "I admire the company you built, but that doesn't automatically make your views on social issues correct. Let's talk about the issues directly." Don't be swayed by flashy resumes when they're not relevant. By recognizing and challenging appeals to accomplishment, you can keep conversations grounded and focused. Arguments should be judged on their own strength, not on someone's past achievements. Because success in one area doesn't guarantee wisdom in another. And if we want honest, productive dialogue, we have to start by separating accomplishments from actual insight. Sunk cost fallacy. Ever felt trapped in a bad decision just because you've already put in so much effort? That's the sunk cost fallacy. A sneaky mental trap where we justify continuing something simply because we've already invested time, money, or energy. Here's how it works. Someone argues that since they've already poured resources into something, they should keep going, even if it no longer makes sense. They're essentially saying, we can't waste what we've already put in. But here's the catch. Past investments are irrelevant to current decisions. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine someone buys concert tickets, but then gets sick. They might say, I already paid for the tickets, so I have to go, even though they feel terrible. But going won't get the money back, and it could make them feel worse. The money is already gone. What matters now is whether going will actually be a good experience. Another example. Someone starts a business that's losing money. They might say, we've invested so much time and money, we can't give up now. But staying the course with a failing business won't magically turn things around. It might just dig the hole deeper. So, why do people fall into this trap? Sometimes it's to avoid admitting a mistake. Continuing lets them pretend they're still on the right path. Other times, it's to justify their actions to others, to avoid looking like they've wasted time or money. And often, it's about coping with the emotional pain of loss. The problem is the sunk cost fallacy leads us away from rational decision-making. It creates a false sense of obligation and can cause us to waste even more resources on something that no longer serves us. How can you spot it? Look for arguments that focus on what's already been spent instead of what makes sense now. Watch for reasoning that ignores current benefits and costs. Ask yourself, is the past investment actually relevant to this decision? And if you do spot it, gently call it out. You could say, I understand that you paid for the tickets, but going won't get the money back. Maybe it's better to rest and feel better. Or, yes, you've invested a lot in the business, but what's the realistic path forward now? By learning to recognize and challenge the sunk cost fallacy, you can make smarter decisions, grounded in the present, not chained to the past. You'll also help create more honest, rational conversations where progress isn't held hostage by what's already gone. Affirming a disjunct fallacy. Investments affirming a disjunct fallacy often sound like, either this is true or that is true. One of these must be right. Ever feel like you're being forced to choose between two options when there are actually more? That's affirming a disjunct, a tricky way to create a false dilemma. It works like this. Someone presents two options as if they're the only possibilities and claims that because one is true, the other must be false. They're essentially saying, it's either this or that, and it's this, so it's not that. But just because one option is true doesn't mean the other is automatically false. Let's break it down. Imagine someone says, either you're a good person or you're a bad person. You're a good person, so you're not a bad person. Sure, being a good person is great, but that doesn't mean someone can't have flaws or make mistakes. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Or take another example. Either the light is on or it's off. The light is on, so it's not off. In a basic on-off switch situation, this might be fine. But what if there's a dimmer switch? What if the light is flickering or the power is unstable? The argument conveniently ignores other real possibilities. So why do people use affirming a disjunct? Sometimes it's a way to simplify complex issues. By narrowing things down to two clear-cut options, the choice feels easier. Other times, it's used to manipulate the conversation or steer it in a particular direction. It can also create a false sense of certainty, making the argument feel more solid than it actually is. The problem? It ignores nuance. It can lead to flawed conclusions and poor decisions. It discourages open-minded thinking and shuts down meaningful dialogue. By focusing only on limited options, it skips over important evidence and alternative perspectives. So how do you spot it? Look for arguments that only offer two choices and then insist that if one is true, the other must be false. Ask yourself, are these options really mutually exclusive? Is there room for a third or fourth possibility? If you notice someone doing it, call it out gently. Try something like, I see you're presenting two options, but I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. Someone can be a good person and still make mistakes. Or, maybe the light isn't just on or off. Maybe there's a dimmer switch or the power's acting up. Don't let false dilemmas corner you. By recognizing and challenging affirming a disjunct fallacies, you can make more informed choices, avoid flawed reasoning, and foster deeper, more thoughtful conversations. Just because one option is true doesn't mean the other must be false. Stay curious. Keep asking questions. And always look for the full picture. Appeal to emotion fallacy. Ever been swayed by a commercial that tugs at your heartstrings or a political speech that fires you up? Most of us have. Emotions are a powerful part of how we make decisions, but they can also be used to manipulate us. That's where the appeal to emotion fallacy comes in. This fallacy happens when someone tries to convince you of something not with logic or evidence, but by playing on your feelings. It's essentially saying, believe me because it feels right, or because it makes you feel something. But just because something stirs an emotion doesn't mean it's true. Take, for example, a charity ad showing heartbreaking images of starving children. You might feel deeply moved and want to donate. But that emotional response doesn't guarantee the charity is effective or that your money will be well spent. The ad relies on emotion, not facts. Another example, a politician gives an impassioned speech about patriotism and national pride. You might feel proud and inspired, but those feelings don't mean their policies are sound. Again, they're appealing to your emotions, not your logic. Why do people use this tactic? Sometimes, it's to distract from a weak argument. When someone lacks solid evidence, they might try to sway you with feelings instead. Other times, it's a deliberate effort to manipulate, bypassing your critical thinking by triggering emotions. And sometimes, it's just a misguided attempt to connect emotionally while failing to provide real support. The issue with the appeal to emotion fallacy is that it can lead to poor or irrational decisions. Emotions matter, but they shouldn't be the only factor in what we believe. We need to weigh facts and evidence too. Otherwise, we open ourselves up to manipulation and deception. So how do you spot this fallacy? Watch for arguments heavy on emotional language or imagery. Be cautious when someone tries to stir strong emotions, fear, anger, pity, without backing their claims logically. Ask yourself, is there any real evidence here? If you spot an appeal to emotion, call it out, respectfully. You might say, these images are heartbreaking, but I'd like to see how the charity actually uses its donations. Or, I admire your passion, but can we go over the actual details of your proposal? Don't let emotion override reason. By recognizing and challenging emotional appeals, you can keep the conversation grounded in evidence and logic. Emotions are valuable, but they should complement, not replace, critical thinking. When we learn to see through the appeal to emotion fallacy, we become better decision makers and more rational thinkers. Suppressed correlative fallacy. Ever feel like someone is claiming two things are inseparable without any real proof? That's the suppressed correlative, a tricky way to create a false dependency. It happens when someone implies that two related terms are mutually dependent, insisting that one cannot exist without the other, without offering real evidence. Essentially, they're saying, if you have this, you must have that, or you can't have one without the other. But just because two things are related doesn't mean they're inseparable. Let's break it down. Imagine someone saying, you can't have a winner without a loser. In a competitive game, sure, there's usually a winner and a loser. But that doesn't mean the idea of winning requires someone else to lose. You can achieve a personal victory, an internal sense of success, without anyone else being defeated. In this case, the correlative is being artificially forced. Another example, you can't have light without darkness. While light and darkness are conceptually linked, they aren't mutually dependent. Light can exist without darkness, like the light from a star shining in the vast, empty expanse of space. The relationship is there, but it's not as strict as the claim implies. So, why do people use the suppressed correlative? Sometimes it's a way to oversimplify complex ideas. By claiming two things are inseparable, they avoid having to explain the subtle nature of their relationship. Other times, it's a rhetorical move to make something seem more necessary or convincing than it really is. And sometimes, it's a tactic to limit a conversation by cutting off alternative possibilities. The problem is that it ignores the potential for independent existence. This kind of thinking can lead to inaccurate conclusions and poor decision-making. It limits meaningful dialogue and avoids a full examination of the issue. So how do you spot it? Watch for arguments that treat related concepts as if they're inseparable. Notice when people dismiss the possibility of independent existence. Ask yourself, are these two things truly dependent on each other? If you do recognize a suppressed correlative, call it out politely. You might say, I get that you're saying you can't have a winner without a loser, but I don't think that's entirely true. You can have a personal victory without someone else losing. Or, I understand what you mean about light and darkness, but light can exist independently, like starlight in space. Don't let yourself be boxed in by false dependencies. By questioning suppressed correlative fallacies, you encourage deeper, more informed conversations. You remind people, and yourself, that just because two ideas are connected doesn't mean they're bound together. Understanding this fallacy helps you think more clearly, make better decisions, and engage in richer, more honest dialogue. The entitled to my opinion fallacy. Ever feel like someone is using their right to an opinion as a shield against any challenge? That's the entitled to my opinion fallacy, a tricky way to avoid defending your views. It's like this. Someone claims that their opinion is immune to criticism simply because it's their opinion. They're essentially saying, I can believe whatever I want, and you can't say anything about it. But while everyone is entitled to their opinions, not all opinions are equally valid. Let's break it down. Imagine someone saying, I believe the earth is flat, and I'm entitled to my opinion. While they are entitled to that belief, it doesn't make it true. There's overwhelming scientific evidence that the earth is a sphere. Simply stating an opinion doesn't make it factual. Another example, someone argues, I think vaccines cause autism, and I'm entitled to my opinion. Again, they're entitled to that belief, but it's harmful because it contradicts scientific consensus and can lead to dangerous decisions. The entitled to my opinion phrase doesn't exempt them from the responsibility to be well-informed. Why do people use the entitled to my opinion fallacy? Sometimes it's a way to avoid defending their beliefs by claiming their opinion is untouchable, thus avoiding having to provide evidence or reasoning. Other times, it's a way to assert intellectual superiority, implying their opinion is beyond criticism, making them feel more powerful. And sometimes it's simply a way to shut down a conversation without any real effort. The problem with the entitled to my opinion fallacy is that it confuses the right to have an opinion with the validity of that opinion. It can lead to accepting false or harmful beliefs without any critical evaluation. It creates a barrier to meaningful dialogue and prevents the exchange of ideas, avoiding the need to engage with actual facts. So how do you spot the entitled to my opinion fallacy? Look for arguments that claim an opinion is immune to criticism. Pay attention to arguments that avoid providing evidence or reasoning. Ask yourself if the opinion is based on facts or just personal feelings. If you spot the entitled to my opinion fallacy, call it out, politely, of course. Say something like, I understand that you have that opinion, but that doesn't mean it's true. Let's look at the evidence that supports or contradicts your belief, or I understand that you're entitled to your opinion, but that doesn't mean it's immune to criticism. Let's discuss the reasoning behind your belief. Don't let someone convince you with empty claims of entitlement. By challenging the entitled to my opinion fallacy, you can have more informed and productive discussions. You can prioritize evaluating beliefs based on evidence and avoid being misled by irrelevant claims of entitlement. Remember, everyone is entitled to their opinions, but not all opinions are equally valid. By learning to identify and address the entitled to my opinion fallacy, you can make more informed decisions and help create a more honest, evidence-based dialogue where beliefs are evaluated based on facts, not just personal feelings. Equivocation fallacy. The feelings equivocation fallacy occurs when a word or phrase with multiple meanings is used in a way that confuses or misleads. It's like when someone plays word games, changing the meaning of a word mid-argument to suit their needs. This trick can make it seem like they're saying one thing when, in fact, they're saying something else. Imagine this scenario. Someone argues that all banks are beside rivers. Therefore, the financial institution where I deposit my money is beside a river. Here, the word bank is used in two different senses, a river bank and a financial bank. By switching the meaning, the person creates a false connection. Another example, someone argues that the end of life is death, and the end of a sentence is death, therefore life is a sentence. In this case, end is used in two different senses, the termination of something and the final part of something. By conflating these meanings, the person creates a nonsensical argument. Sometimes, people use equivocation unintentionally, not realizing that a word has multiple meanings. Other times, it's a deliberate attempt to deceive, taking advantage of language's ambiguity to make an argument seem more convincing. In some cases, it's even used to create a humorous or confusing effect. The problem with equivocation is that it undermines clear communication. It creates confusion and ambiguity, making it difficult to understand the actual point being made. It can lead to false conclusions and misleading arguments. To spot an equivocation fallacy, look for arguments that use words or phrases with multiple meanings. Pay attention to when the meaning of a word seems to switch mid-sentence. Ask yourself if the word is being used consistently throughout the argument. If you spot an equivocation fallacy, call it out politely. For example, you might say, I understand you're saying all banks are beside rivers, but you're using bank in two different senses, a river bank and a financial bank. Or, I understand you're comparing the end of life to the end of a sentence, but you're using end in two different senses. By challenging equivocation fallacies, you can foster more clear and accurate discussions. You can focus on the actual meanings of words and avoid being misled by ambiguity. Words have specific meanings, and those meanings shouldn't change mid-argument. By learning to identify and address equivocation fallacies, you help ensure that dialogue remains precise, accurate, and consistent. Etymological fallacy. Etymological fallacy refers to the mistaken belief that the original meaning of a word must be its current meaning. Have you ever tried to understand a word's current meaning by only looking at its origin? That's the essence of the etymological fallacy, a deceptive way of claiming that a word's meaning has remained the same over time, despite the fact that language constantly evolves. It's like arguing that the current meaning of a word should be the same as its original meaning, while overlooking how words change as they adapt to new contexts. For example, someone might argue that the word nice must mean ignorant because that was its original meaning. It's true that nice once meant ignorant, but over time, its meaning has shifted to pleasant or kind. By ignoring this change, the person is committing the etymological fallacy. Similarly, someone could argue that awful must mean full of awe, which was its original meaning, but now it means terrible or dreadful. Again, this argument ignores the evolution of language. So why do people sometimes use the etymological fallacy? Often, it's a way to create a false sense of authority. By claiming to know the true meaning of a word, they make themselves appear more knowledgeable. Other times, it's used to manipulate language, twisting an outdated meaning to fit a particular agenda. Sometimes, it's just a way of reinforcing a belief based on an outdated linguistic connection. The problem with the etymological fallacy is that it overlooks the dynamic nature of language, leading to misunderstandings and misinterpretations. It creates a false sense of certainty and prevents meaningful communication by disregarding the current usage of words. To spot the etymological fallacy, look for arguments that claim a word's current meaning must be the same as its original meaning. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the evolution of language. Ask yourself whether the original meaning is still relevant today. If you notice someone committing the etymological fallacy, politely point it out. You might say something like, "I understand that nice originally meant ignorant, but its current meaning is pleasant, so let's focus on that." Or, "I understand that awful originally meant full of awe, but today it means terrible, so let's focus on the current meaning." By challenging the etymological fallacy, you can have more accurate and informed discussions. It encourages us to prioritize the current meanings of words and avoid being misled by outdated interpretations. Words change over time, and recognizing this allows for more precise and effective dialogue. By identifying and addressing the etymological fallacy, you can help ensure that conversations are grounded in the meanings of words as they are used today. Fallacy. The fallacy is the mistaken belief that if an argument contains a fallacy, the conclusion must be false. While it may seem like a simple way to dismiss an argument, this assumption isn't always correct. Just because an argument is flawed doesn't automatically mean that its conclusion is wrong. For example, consider someone arguing that everyone knows that aliens built the pyramids, so it must be true. This argument relies on the appeal to popularity fallacy, but just because it's a flawed argument doesn't mean that the possibility of aliens being involved in building the pyramids is completely ruled out. The fallacy doesn't negate the possibility, even if it seems unlikely. In another case, someone might argue, "My grandpa smoked a pack a day and lived to 90, so smoking isn't that bad." This is an example of a hasty generalization fallacy, but the fallacy doesn't mean smoking is safe or harmless. Even though the argument is flawed, smoking is still harmful. People fall for the fallacy for a few reasons. Sometimes, it's used to shut down a debate quickly by pointing out a flaw, making it seem like the person has won. Other times, people assume that for a conclusion to be true, the argument must be logically perfect, and they dismiss any flaws in reasoning. Additionally, it can be used as a way to feel superior, like trapping someone in their mistakes. The problem with the fallacy is that it dismisses the distinction between the argument and the conclusion. While an argument might contain errors, the conclusion could still be valid. Relying on the fallacy can lead to disregarding valid claims simply because the argument supporting them was flawed. It makes people think that things are either completely correct or completely wrong, oversimplifying complex issues. To avoid falling for the fallacy, look out for arguments that dismiss a conclusion just because a fallacy was used. Pay attention to whether the conclusion could still be true despite a flawed argument. If you encounter a fallacy, call it out respectfully, pointing out that an argument can be flawed while the conclusion might still hold some truth. By recognizing and challenging fallacies, you can have more nuanced discussions and focus on the actual truth of the conclusion rather than being misled by the mistakes in the argument. A flawed argument doesn't mean the conclusion is false. Identifying and addressing fallacies helps create a more balanced conversation, where conclusions are evaluated based on their own merits, not just the flaws in the arguments that support them. False dilemma fallacy. Have you ever been told you're either with us or against us? Or maybe if you don't like this country, then leave? These statements might sound forceful, but they often conceal a sneaky trick called the false dilemma. It's when you're given only two options, even though there are many more to consider. Imagine you're deciding what to have for dinner, and someone says you can either have pizza or salad. But what if you want pasta or a sandwich, or maybe you're not hungry at all? The false dilemma, also known as the false dichotomy or black and white thinking, forces you into a choice between two extremes, ignoring all the other possibilities. This happens all the time in debates and arguments. For example, someone might say, "We either need to cut funding for public schools, or our children will never learn anything." But that's not true. There are plenty of other options, like improving teacher training, investing in new resources, or changing the curriculum. By presenting only two choices, they limit your thinking and push you toward their preferred option. It's like someone showing you a picture in just black and white when the world is full of vibrant colors. They oversimplify complex issues, making it seem like there are only two sides when there are many shades of gray. So why do people use false dilemmas? Often, it's a way to manipulate you by limiting your choices, making their preferred option seem more appealing. It creates a sense of urgency or fear, pushing you to make a quick decision without considering all the facts. Sometimes, it's not intentional. People might genuinely believe that there are only two options. They may be stuck in a rigid way of thinking and unable to see other possibilities. But whether it's intentional or not, the false dilemma can lead to poor decisions. How do you spot a false dilemma? Look for words like either slash or only, always, and never. These often signal that someone is limiting your choices. Also, ask yourself if there are other possibilities. Is there a middle ground? Are there alternative solutions? If you spot a false dilemma, call it out politely. You might say something like, "I don't think those are the only two options. There are other possibilities we should consider," or, "I understand you're trying to simplify the issue, but I think we need to explore all the options." By recognizing and challenging false dilemmas, you can have more open and honest conversations. You can explore all options and make better decisions. Remember, the world isn't black and white. There are many shades of gray, and it's important to consider them all. By learning to see past false dilemmas, you can avoid being tricked into decisions that aren't in your best interest and help others see the bigger picture as well. Genetic fallacy. You've probably heard statements like, "That idea is bad because of who created it," or "This can't be true because of where it came from." These kinds of statements aim to discredit an idea based on its origin, not its actual merit. This is called the genetic fallacy, a sneaky way of dismissing something without directly addressing its content. The genetic fallacy happens when someone judges an idea or belief solely based on its source, rather than its validity. In essence, they're saying it's bad because of where it came from, but the origin of an idea doesn't automatically make it true or false. Let's break this down. Imagine someone arguing that a scientific study is biased and wrong simply because it was funded by a large corporation. While it's true that funding sources can sometimes influence research, this alone doesn't invalidate the study's findings. The study should be evaluated based on its methodology and evidence, not just its funding. Another example. Someone claims that a political ideology is dangerous because it originated with a group of extremists. But just because an ideology has a controversial origin doesn't mean all its ideas are inherently bad. The ideology should be judged based on its specific principles and policies, not just its history. So, why do people use the genetic fallacy? Sometimes it's an easy way to avoid engaging with opposing viewpoints. By dismissing an idea based on its source, they can bypass addressing its actual arguments. Other times, it's used to reinforce existing biases. Associating an idea with a negative source makes it seem less appealing. And sometimes, it's just a shortcut to judgment, saving the trouble of doing the research. The problem with the genetic fallacy is that it dismisses ideas without evaluating them on their own merits. This can lead to overlooking valid claims simply because they're associated with an irrelevant source. It shuts down productive dialogue and prevents us from considering different perspectives. So, how do you spot a genetic fallacy? Look for arguments that discredit an idea based on where it came from. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the content of the idea itself. Ask yourself whether the origin of the idea is actually relevant to its validity. If you spot a genetic fallacy, call it out, politely, of course. You might say something like, "I understand the study was funded by a corporation, but let's focus on the methodology and evidence, not just its funding." Or, "I understand the ideology has a controversial origin, but let's evaluate its specific principles and policies." Don't let someone convince you with irrelevant associations. By challenging genetic fallacies, you can have more informed and objective discussions, focusing on the actual content of ideas rather than being misled by their origins. Remember, an idea's source doesn't determine its validity. By learning to identify and address genetic fallacies, you'll make more informed decisions and contribute to more open and fair dialogue where ideas are evaluated on their own merits, not just their origins. Appeal to ignorance fallacy. The appeal to ignorance is a fallacy where someone claims something is true simply because it hasn't been proven false, or vice versa. Since we don't know something, it must be true. This kind of logic can sneak into conversations without us even realizing it. It's essentially a way of arguing that we don't know, so it must be. But here's the thing. The absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. Let's break this down. Imagine someone says, "No one has proven that ghosts don't exist, so they must exist." While it's true that we haven't definitively proven ghosts don't exist, that doesn't automatically mean they do. The lack of proof in either direction doesn't confirm anything. Or consider this. Someone claims that because scientists haven't proven a certain supplement doesn't cure the common cold. It probably does. But the absence of evidence against something doesn't automatically make it true. The burden of proof lies with the person making the claim, not with those who haven't disproven it. So why do people use the appeal to ignorance? Sometimes, it's a way to avoid providing evidence when their claim is weak, shifting the burden of proof onto others. Other times, it's a way to create a false sense of certainty, claiming something is true simply because it hasn't been disproven. It can also be used to justify beliefs based on a lack of understanding. The problem with this fallacy is that it ignores the necessity of evidence. It can lead to accepting claims without real support and relies on an absence of knowledge, which isn't a reliable foundation for truth. It opens the door for any claim to be considered, no matter how far-fetched, simply because it hasn't been disproven. How can you spot an appeal to ignorance? Look for arguments that claim something is true because it hasn't been proven false. Pay attention to arguments that rely on the absence of evidence. Ask yourself whether the lack of proof actually supports the claim being made. If you catch someone using an appeal to ignorance, call it out politely. You could say, "I understand that no one has proven ghosts don't exist, but that doesn't mean they do. We need actual evidence to support the claim." Or, "I understand scientists haven't disproven this supplement, but that doesn't mean it cures the common cold." Remember, the burden of proof lies with the person making the claim. Don't let empty claims convince you. By challenging appeals to ignorance, you can foster more logical and informed conversations, focusing on the real evidence and avoiding being misled by the absence of counter-evidence. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Recognizing and addressing this fallacy helps ensure that claims are supported by facts, not just the lack of disproof. Tone policing fallacy. Tone policing is when someone criticizes how you say something instead of what you're actually saying. Ever been told that your tone is the real problem, rather than the content of your message? That's tone policing, a tricky tactic used to distract from the actual issue. It focuses on the tone of your message to dismiss or invalidate your argument, essentially suggesting that your feelings are showing, so you're wrong. However, how you say something doesn't change whether what you're saying is true. Let's break it down. Imagine someone expresses frustration about a social injustice. A tone policing response might be, "You're being too emotional. If you were calmer, people would listen to you." In this case, they avoid addressing the injustice and instead focus on the emotional tone, implying that the message is invalid because of how it's delivered. Another example is when someone criticizes a harmful policy. The tone policing response might be, "Your language is too aggressive. You need to be more respectful." Again, the person avoids discussing the policy and shifts the focus to the speaker's choice of words, making it seem like the delivery is the problem, not the message. So, why do people use tone policing? Sometimes, it's a way to avoid uncomfortable conversations. By focusing on tone, they can sidestep engaging with difficult issues. Other times, it's a tactic to silence marginalized voices by criticizing their tone, making them feel like their concerns are invalid. Sometimes, it's a way to assert power and control, dictating how someone should express themselves to maintain dominance. The problem with tone policing is that it distracts from real issues. It ignores the importance of addressing substantive concerns and can silence important voices, preventing meaningful dialogue. It prioritizes politeness over addressing injustice. How can you spot tone policing? Look for arguments that focus on the tone of a message rather than its content. Pay attention to arguments that dismiss valid concerns based on how they're expressed. Ask yourself if the person is actually addressing the issue at hand. If you spot tone policing, call it out, politely, of course. You can say, "I understand that you find my tone emotional, but let's focus on the actual issue of social injustice." Or, "I understand that you think my language is aggressive, but let's discuss the harmful policy." By challenging tone policing, you can have more productive and focused discussions. You can prioritize addressing substantive concerns and avoid being sidetracked by irrelevant criticisms. Remember, how you say something doesn't change whether what you're saying is true. By learning to identify and address tone policing, you can help create a more honest and focused dialogue where concerns are addressed, not silenced. Ambiguity fallacy. Ever feel like someone is using vague language to confuse you? That's the ambiguity fallacy, a tricky way to make arguments seem stronger than they are. It happens when someone uses a word or phrase with multiple meanings, obscuring the true meaning of their argument. They're essentially saying it could mean this or that, depending on what suits them. But using vague language doesn't make an argument valid. Let's break it down. Imagine someone saying, "The sign said fine for parking here, so I parked here all day." But fine could mean acceptable or a penalty. The sign might have meant there was a penalty for parking there, but the person is using the ambiguity of the word fine to justify their actions. Another example, someone argues, "What we need is a more radical approach," but radical could mean extreme or fundamental. The person might be using the word to appeal to those who want extreme change while not alienating those who want fundamental change. They are using the ambiguity to appeal to multiple groups. Why do people use the ambiguity fallacy? Sometimes it's unintentional. They might not realize they're using a word with multiple meanings. Other times, it's a deliberate attempt to deceive. By using vague language, they can make their arguments seem more convincing than they actually are. And sometimes, it's a way to avoid committing to a specific position. The problem with the ambiguity fallacy is that it undermines clear communication. It creates confusion, making it difficult to understand the actual point being made. It can lead to false conclusions and misleading arguments, avoiding the need to be specific. So, how do you spot an ambiguity fallacy? Look for arguments that use words or phrases with multiple meanings. Pay attention to arguments that seem to switch the meaning of a word mid-sentence. Ask yourself if the word is being used consistently throughout the argument. If you spot an ambiguity fallacy, call it out politely. You could say, "I understand that you said fine for parking here, but fine could mean acceptable or a penalty. We need to clarify which meaning you intended." Or, I understand that you want a radical approach, but radical could mean extreme or fundamental. We need to define what you mean. Don't let someone convince you with vague language. By challenging ambiguity fallacies, you can have clearer and more accurate discussions. You can focus on the actual meanings of words and avoid being misled by ambiguity. Remember, words have specific meanings, and those meanings shouldn't be changed or obscured. By learning to identify and address ambiguity fallacies, you can have more meaningful discussions and avoid being misled by deceptive language. This helps create a more precise and accurate dialogue where words are used consistently. Anecdotal fallacy. Anecdotal fallacy occurs when someone uses a personal story or isolated example to argue against broader statistics or established truths. While personal experiences are relatable and memorable, relying too heavily on them can mislead us and lead to incorrect conclusions. For example, imagine someone saying, "Vaccines are dangerous because my cousin's child got sick after getting vaccinated." While it's true that individuals can have adverse reactions to vaccines, this singular anecdote doesn't negate the vast body of scientific evidence showing that vaccines are safe and effective. The person is essentially elevating one personal story over well-established facts. Another common example is someone claiming climate change isn't real because we had a record cold winter. While weather patterns can vary, a short-term weather event doesn't disprove long-term trends, such as the rising global temperatures linked to climate change. Again, a single isolated incident is being used to challenge a much larger body of evidence. People often resort to the anecdotal fallacy because personal stories are more relatable and emotionally impactful than abstract data. Sometimes, it's due to a distrust of large data sets or scientific studies, or a way to dismiss information that contradicts personal beliefs. However, the issue with anecdotal reasoning is that it ignores the importance of representative data, which can lead to bad decisions based on faulty reasoning. To spot an anecdotal fallacy, look for arguments that depend heavily on personal stories or specific examples to dismiss statistical data or general truths. Ask yourself whether the anecdote truly represents the larger population or whether it's an isolated case. If you encounter an anecdotal fallacy, it's helpful to point it out politely, saying something like, "I understand that your cousin's child had a reaction, but that doesn't change the fact that vaccines are generally safe and effective," or "I understand that you had a cold winter, but that doesn't disprove long-term climate trends." By calling out anecdotal fallacies, you can contribute to more rational, evidence-based conversations. Personal stories have value, but they shouldn't be used as a substitute for data and factual evidence. Being able to identify and challenge anecdotal fallacies will help you make more informed decisions and keep discussions grounded in reality, rather than being swayed by isolated, unrepresentative experiences. Circumstantial ad hominem fallacy. Ever feel like your arguments are dismissed because of who you are, rather than the content of what you're saying? This is the circumstantial ad hominem fallacy, a subtle way to attack the person making the argument, rather than addressing the argument itself. It typically looks like this. Someone challenges your point by pointing to your background or circumstances, suggesting that those factors make your argument invalid. They might say, "You're only saying that because of your situation," or "You're biased because of your background." But here's the truth. Your circumstances don't automatically disprove your arguments. Just because someone has a certain background or situation doesn't mean their reasoning is flawed. Let's break it down. Imagine a politician pushing for a tax cut, and someone responds with, "Of course you want a tax cut. You're a billionaire." While the politician's wealth might influence their perspective, it doesn't automatically make their argument for a tax cut wrong. The argument should be assessed on its merits, not just on the politician's wealth. Another example, someone argues for stricter environmental regulations, and a critic replies, "You're only saying that because you live in a wealthy suburb and don't care about jobs." Again, The person's living situation may influence their perspective, but it doesn't negate the validity of their argument for stronger environmental protections. The focus should be on the argument, not the speaker's location. So, why do people use circumstantial ad hominem attacks? Often, it's a tactic to avoid engaging with the actual argument. By attacking the person's background, the attacker can sidestep the issue at hand. It may also be used to cast doubt on the person's credibility, implying bias without addressing the substance of their argument. In some cases, it's simply a shortcut to shutting down a conversation without actually discussing the issue. The problem with circumstantial ad hominem fallacies is that they prevent constructive dialogue. Instead of focusing on the merits of an argument, they target irrelevant factors like someone's background or situation. This leads to dismissing valid points based on personal circumstances, creating a hostile atmosphere where productive debate is harder to achieve. So, how do you spot a circumstantial ad hominem fallacy? Look for arguments that focus on the person's background rather than the substance of their argument. Pay attention to accusations of bias based on irrelevant factors, like someone's wealth, location, or profession. Ask yourself whether the person's circumstances actually impact the validity of the argument being made. If you spot a circumstantial ad hominem, call it out politely. You might say something like, "I understand that my wealth might influence my views, but let's focus on the actual argument for and against the tax cut." Or, "I know where I live might affect my perspective, but let's address the real issues with environmental regulations." By addressing these fallacies, you help steer the conversation back to the core issue, avoiding distractions based on irrelevant circumstances. In summary, your circumstances don't automatically make your arguments wrong. By recognizing and challenging circumstantial ad hominem fallacies, you can promote more informed, focused discussions where ideas are evaluated on their merits, not on personal biases or irrelevant factors. Composition fallacy. The composition fallacy occurs when someone assumes that if each part of something is good, then the whole must be good too. For example, they might think that if the ingredients in a cake are tasty, then the cake itself will also be tasty. It sounds logical, right? But sometimes, we make the mistake of assuming the whole is just the sum of its parts. This is where the composition fallacy comes in. It's the belief that if something is true for the individual components, it must also be true for the whole. However, that's not always the case. Let's break this down. Imagine a sports team with many talented individual players. Someone might argue, this team has the best players at every position, so they must be the best team overall. But that's not necessarily true. Teamwork, strategy, and chemistry are also important factors. Individual talent alone doesn't guarantee overall success. Another example. Someone claims that because these individual bricks are strong, the wall made of them must be strong. But the wall's strength also depends on how the bricks are arranged and the quality of the mortar. Just because the individual components are strong doesn't mean the whole structure will be. So, why do people fall for the composition fallacy? Sometimes it's a matter of simplifying complex systems. We tend to focus on the individual components and ignore how they interact with each other. Other times, it's wishful thinking. We want to believe that good parts will automatically lead to a good whole. And sometimes, it's a way to avoid considering the bigger picture. The problem with the composition fallacy is that it overlooks the importance of emergent properties. Systems are often more than just the sum of their parts. New properties can emerge from the interactions between components, which can lead to inaccurate predictions and bad decisions. How can you spot a composition fallacy? Look for arguments that assume the whole is simply the sum of its parts. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the interactions between components. Ask yourself if the properties of the whole are necessarily the same as the properties of the parts. If you spot a composition fallacy, call it out politely. You could say something like, "I understand that this team has talented players, but that doesn't guarantee they'll be the best team overall. Teamwork is also important," or, I understand that these bricks are strong, but the wall's strength also depends on how they're arranged. By challenging composition fallacies, you can have more accurate and informed discussions. You can focus on the bigger picture and avoid being misled by simplistic reasoning. Remember, the whole is not always the sum of its parts. By learning to identify and address composition fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by flawed assumptions. You'll contribute to a more nuanced and accurate understanding of systems, where interactions and emergent properties play key roles. Continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy is when someone dismisses a valid point by arguing there's no clear boundary between two extremes. It's a tricky way of rejecting a distinction by claiming that the absence of a sharp dividing line means there's no real difference between the two. However, just because there's no precise line doesn't mean meaningful distinctions don't exist. For example, someone might argue against speed limits by saying, "Where do you draw the line between safe and unsafe speed?" They claim there's no clear dividing line, so speed limits are unnecessary. While it's true that no single speed is definitively safe or unsafe, that doesn't mean there isn't a significant difference between driving 20 miles per hour and 100 miles per hour, especially when it comes to the risk involved. Similarly, someone arguing against raising the minimum wage might say, "Where do you draw the line between a living wage and a poverty wage? It's all a gradual change, so why bother?" While no specific wage definitively separates living from poverty, there's a clear difference between a $7 wage and a $15 wage when it comes to people's living standards. People use the continuum fallacy for various reasons. It might be a way to avoid addressing the actual issue, creating a false sense of uncertainty, or deflecting the need to take a stand. But the danger lies in ignoring the importance of recognizing meaningful distinctions. This fallacy can lead to dismissing valid concerns and prevent necessary action by creating a false equivalence between things that are not truly equivalent. To spot a continuum fallacy, look for arguments that dismiss distinctions by claiming there's no sharp boundary. Pay attention to whether the absence of a clear dividing line is being used to deny any real difference. If you notice this, challenge it politely. For example, you could say, "I understand that there's no single speed that's definitively safe, but that doesn't mean there's no difference between 20 miles per hour and 100 miles per hour. Let's focus on the relative risks." Or, "I understand that there's no clear wage that marks the boundary between poverty and a living wage, but that doesn't mean there's no difference between $7 and $15. Let's focus on the relative living standards." By calling out the continuum fallacy, you can steer the conversation toward more focused and productive discussions. Recognizing meaningful distinctions helps avoid being misled by irrelevant claims about gradual change and sharp boundaries. Just because there's no obvious line doesn't mean meaningful differences don't exist, and addressing this fallacy can foster more informed and nuanced dialogue. Definist fallacy. Dismiss deafness fallacy. You're changing the definition, or that's not what that word really means. Ever feel like someone is arguing about the meaning of a word, not the actual issue? That's the definist fallacy, a tricky way to win an argument by redefining terms. Here's how it works. Someone argues that a claim is false simply because it doesn't fit their personal definition of a key term. They're essentially saying, "You're wrong because you're using the wrong definition." But definitions can be subjective, and changing them doesn't change the underlying reality. Imagine someone arguing whether a certain action was courageous. Someone using the definist fallacy might say, "That wasn't courageous because courage means being fearless." While that's one definition of courage, it's not the only one. Many people define courage as acting despite fear. The person is using their own definition to dismiss someone else's perspective. Another example, someone argues whether a certain policy is fair. The response, "That's not fair because fairness means everyone gets the exact same thing." Again, that's one definition of fairness, but another common one is that fairness means everyone gets what they need. By insisting on their own definition, the person sidesteps the actual argument. Why do people use the definite fallacy? Sometimes it's a way to avoid engaging with the real issue. Arguing about definitions is easier than dealing with complex topics. Other times, it's a form of intellectual one-upmanship, claiming their interpretation is the only valid one, which can create a false sense of superiority. And often, it's simply a tactic to shut down a conversation with minimal effort. The problem with the definite fallacy is that it blocks meaningful discussion. It dismisses valid perspectives, derails the conversation, and creates a false sense of certainty. Instead of engaging with the real substance of the topic, the discussion gets stuck in a loop about semantics. So, how can you spot a definite fallacy? Look out for arguments that dismiss claims purely based on a personal definition of a key term. Watch for an unwillingness to acknowledge alternative meanings. Ask yourself, is this definition the only possible one? And if you spot it, call it out gently. You might say, I understand that you define courage as being fearless, but many define it as acting despite fear. Let's talk about the action itself. Or, I see you define fairness as equal treatment, but others define it as equitable treatment. Can we focus on the policy's impact? Don't let arguments get derailed by irrelevant debates over wording. By recognizing and challenging definite fallacies, you can bring the conversation back to what really matters, the actual issue. Definitions are just tools. Don't let them become weapons. Appeal to the stone fallacy. Ever been dismissed without a second thought? That's the appeal to the stone, a blunt way to reject an idea without any real reason. It's like someone says, that's just nonsense, or I refuse to believe that, and leaves it at that. No evidence. No counterargument. Just a flat-out dismissal. They're essentially saying, I don't like it, so it's wrong. But disliking something doesn't make it untrue. Let's break it down. Imagine someone presents scientific evidence that challenges a long-held belief. Someone using the appeal to the stone might respond, that's ridiculous, I don't believe it. They offer no counter-evidence, no logical reasoning, just disbelief treated like a solid, unmovable stone. Or take another example. Someone proposes a new solution to a complex problem. The response, that's just crazy. It'll never work. Again, no explanation, just a knee-jerk rejection. It's as if their personal opinion overrides any possibility of the idea being valid. Why do people use the appeal to the stone? Sometimes it's to avoid cognitive dissonance. When information threatens their worldview, dismissing it helps them stay comfortable. Other times, it's a way to dodge intellectual effort. Declaring something absurd is easier than engaging with it. And sometimes, it's a power move. Dismissing others' ideas can be a way to assert dominance or superiority. The problem with this fallacy is that it shuts down constructive dialogue. It ignores evidence and prevents us from considering other perspectives. It treats disbelief as if it were a legitimate argument. So how do you spot an appeal to the stone? Look for dismissals that come without reasoning. Watch for arguments that lean solely on personal opinion or disbelief. Ask yourself, is the person offering any real evidence or counterpoints? If you spot one, call it out gently. Say something like, I understand that you find the scientific evidence challenging, but simply dismissing it doesn't make it untrue. Let's talk about the actual data. Or, you think the idea sounds crazy, but can we explore the logic behind it? Don't let empty dismissals guide your thinking. By recognizing and challenging appeals to the stone, you can foster deeper, more informed conversations. Ones grounded in reason, not just reaction. Disbelief alone isn't an argument. And when we focus on evidence over opinion, we open the door to clearer, more productive dialogue. Hasty generalization fallacy. Ever heard someone say, my grandpa smoked a pack a day and lived to 90, so smoking can't be that bad? Or, I know a guy who won the lottery, so buying tickets is a sure way to get rich. These kinds of statements might sound convincing at first, but they often fall into a common thinking trap known as the hasty generalization fallacy. It's like looking at a tiny piece of a puzzle and trying to guess what the whole picture looks like. You're drawing a broad conclusion based on limited or insufficient evidence, taking a small sample size and applying it to a much larger group. Imagine you're visiting a new city and you see 3 people driving recklessly. You might think, wow, everyone in this city drives like a maniac. But that's a hasty generalization. You saw only a few drivers and assumed they represent the entire population. Another example, someone tries a new restaurant and says, the food was terrible, so everything on the menu must be bad. One bad experience doesn't justify a sweeping conclusion about the whole restaurant. Why do people make hasty generalizations? Sometimes it's simply convenient. It's easier to make a quick judgment than to gather more data. Other times, it's because of bias. We tend to remember information that supports our existing beliefs and ignore what contradicts them. The problem with hasty generalizations is that they can lead to inaccurate and unfair conclusions. They can reinforce stereotypes, fuel prejudices, and result in bad decisions. If you generalize about a product or service based on a single review, you might miss out on something worthwhile. So, how do you spot a hasty generalization? Look for sweeping words like all, every, always, or never. These often signal overgeneralizations. Then ask yourself, is the evidence strong enough? Is the sample size large and diverse enough to support the claim? When you come across a hasty generalization, call it out politely. Say something like, I see your point, but I don't think a few examples are enough to draw that conclusion. Or, maybe we need more data before making that assumption. Don't let flimsy evidence guide your thinking. By challenging hasty generalizations, you can have more accurate and fair conversations. You stay focused on real evidence and avoid misleading assumptions. Just because something is true for a few people doesn't mean it's true for everyone. Learning to spot and avoid this fallacy helps you make better decisions and engage in more logical, balanced discussions. Historian's fallacy. The historian's fallacy happens when we judge people from the past as if they had access to the information we have now. It's the mistake of assuming that historical figures should have known better, even though they were acting within the limits of their own time and knowledge. This fallacy often shows up when people evaluate past actions or decisions based on what we know today, ignoring the context those individuals were living in. For example, someone might criticize a general from a past war for making a strategic error and say, the general should have known the enemy was planning an ambush. But at the time, that general didn't have access to the intelligence we now have. They were making decisions based on what was available to them then, not on what we know now. Another example is when someone criticizes a historical scientist for holding a now-disproven belief. They might say, the scientist should have known their theory was wrong. But that scientist was operating with the best available knowledge of their era. Judging them based on our current understanding is unfair and commits the historian's fallacy. Why do people fall into this trap? Sometimes it's a way to feel smarter or more morally evolved than people in the past. It can also simplify complex historical events, making them easier to judge or dismiss. And sometimes, it's used to justify current opinions by demonizing past actions without truly understanding them. The problem is that this kind of thinking distorts history. It creates unfair judgments, inaccurate interpretations, and a false sense of superiority. It also prevents us from learning important lessons because it discourages us from fully engaging with the complexity of historical contexts. To avoid falling into the historian's fallacy, be on the lookout for arguments that rely on hindsight. Ask yourself, did the person being judged have access to the information we do now? Are we accounting for what they knew at the time? If you catch someone making this mistake, gently push back. You can say something like, I see why that decision seems flawed now, but at the time, they were working with very different information, or they were using the best knowledge available in their era. Challenging the historian's fallacy helps lead to more accurate, thoughtful conversations about the past. It promotes deeper understanding and guards against the biases of the present. Always remember, people in the past didn't know what we know today. Recognizing that simple fact can completely change how we interpret history. Ignoratio elenchi fallacy, aka missing the point. Ever been in a conversation where someone seems to be arguing against a completely different point than the one you made? That's ignoratio elenchi, also known as missing the point. It's a subtle way to derail a discussion. Someone presents an argument that may be valid in itself, but it doesn't actually respond to the issue at hand. They're essentially saying, "I'm right, but about something else entirely." Being right about something unrelated doesn't invalidate the original point. Let's break it down. Imagine someone argues for the need for better public transportation. A person using ignoratio elenchi might reply, "But think of the jobs created by building more roads." Job creation is a valid topic, but it doesn't address the transportation issue. They're missing the point. Or consider someone criticizing a politician's stance on environmental issues. The response, "But that politician is a great family person. Being a good parent is admirable, but it's irrelevant to their environmental policies." Why do people use this fallacy? Sometimes it's unintentional. They may genuinely misunderstand the original point. Other times, it's a tactic to avoid engaging with tough issues. By shifting the topic, they can dodge the real problem. And in some cases, it's used to confuse or distract, derailing the conversation entirely. The issue with ignoratio elenchi is that it blocks meaningful dialogue. It sidesteps the actual topic, leading to circular or fruitless arguments. It gives the illusion of debate while avoiding the real matter at hand. So how do you spot it? Look for responses that don't address the original point. Notice when new, unrelated topics are introduced. Ask yourself, is this really a response to the issue at hand? If you catch it, call it out, respectfully. Try saying, "I understand that job creation is important, but that doesn't address the need for better public transportation." Or, "I hear you about the politician's family values, but that doesn't relate to their environmental stance." Don't let irrelevant arguments cloud the issue. By recognizing and challenging ignoratio elenchi, you can keep discussions focused, constructive, and grounded in what actually matters. Being right about something else doesn't make someone right in this conversation. Identifying flawed reasoning helps foster better, clearer, and more honest dialogue. Incomplete comparison fallacy. Ever feel like a comparison is missing some crucial information? That's the incomplete comparison fallacy, a tricky way to make something seem better than it is by leaving out important details. It happens when someone makes a comparison without clearly specifying what is being compared or what the standard is. They're essentially saying something is better, faster, or more efficient, without telling you better than what, or in what way. Let's break it down. Imagine an advertisement that says, "Our phone has a faster processor." Sounds impressive, right? But faster than what? Last year's model? A competitor's phone? Faster at running apps, games, or just browsing the internet? Without context, the claim is empty. Here's another. "This car is more fuel efficient." Great, but compared to what? A pickup truck? The average sedan? Is it more efficient in city traffic or on the highway? Again, without specific comparisons, the statement doesn't really tell you anything useful. Why do people use incomplete comparisons? Sometimes it's to create a false sense of superiority. Vague claims make a product or idea seem better than it actually is. Other times, it's to dodge providing specific evidence. By keeping things unclear, they avoid being held accountable for their claims. And often, it's just a way to exploit our tendency to assume that the comparison is favorable. The problem is that incomplete comparisons mislead. They can cause people to make poor decisions based on half-truths. They prevent meaningful evaluations and obscure the real value of things. So, how can you spot an incomplete comparison? Look for claims that don't clearly define what's being compared. Ask questions. Is the comparison complete? Is it specific? If not, you're likely dealing with a fallacy. When you hear something vague, politely challenge it. Say things like, "You say this phone has a faster processor." Faster than what, exactly? Or "This car is more fuel efficient." But compared to what? Can you give more details? By calling out incomplete comparisons, you promote clearer, more honest discussions. You help ensure that decisions are based on full, meaningful information, not just marketing spin or rhetorical tricks. A comparison only carries weight when it's complete and specific. Learning to spot and address incomplete comparisons leads to better thinking, better choices, and better conversations. Loaded question fallacy. Ever been asked a question that feels like a trap no matter how you answer? Like, have you stopped beating your wife? Even if you've never hurt anyone, that's a classic example of a loaded question. It's a sneaky way to imply something without directly stating it. A loaded question contains an assumption, often harmful or misleading. It's essentially saying, answer this question and you'll admit to something you didn't do. The danger is, just by responding, you might seem to accept the assumption behind it. Take this question, why are politicians so corrupt? It assumes all politicians are corrupt, which isn't necessarily true. There are both honest and dishonest politicians. But phrased that way, the question implies corruption is the norm. Another example, when will you stop wasting taxpayer money on useless projects? This assumes the projects are, in fact, useless, a subjective claim. They might actually be important to others. The question leads the conversation in a certain direction without proving its point. Why do people use loaded questions? Sometimes it's a manipulation tactic. By embedding assumptions, they control the narrative. Other times, it's a way to discredit someone or imply wrongdoing. And often, it's a shortcut to making a point without offering actual evidence. The real problem with loaded questions is they force people into a defensive position. You're stuck either denying the assumption, possibly sounding guilty, or accepting it, which hurts your credibility. It's a lose-lose situation. So how do you spot a loaded question? Look for hidden assumptions or emotionally charged words. Ask yourself, is this a fair and neutral question? If not, you've likely found a loaded one. When you encounter a loaded question, call it out politely. Try saying, I'm not going to answer that because it assumes all politicians are corrupt, which I don't believe, or that question assumes the projects are useless, which is a matter of opinion. You don't have to play along. By recognizing and addressing loaded questions, you encourage more honest, productive dialogue. You avoid being boxed into a defensive corner and instead focus on the actual issues. Just because someone asks a question doesn't mean you're obligated to answer it, especially if the question itself is unfair. Ludic fallacy. Accepted the ludic fallacy? Life is a game, right? Just calculate the odds. Ever tried to apply the perfect rules of a game to the messy reality of life? That's the ludic fallacy, a tricky way of thinking we can predict the unpredictable. It goes like this. Someone assumes that because something can be measured or modeled in a game or a simplified system, it can be perfectly understood and predicted in the real world. They're essentially saying, if it works in the game, it works in life. But life isn't a game. Imagine someone using complex mathematical models to predict the stock market. Sure, models can be useful tools, but the stock market is shaped by countless unpredictable forces: human emotion, political events, sudden news. The model can't account for all that. The person commits the ludic fallacy by assuming the model is flawless. Or take someone trying to predict the outcome of a war using only game theory. Game theory can offer insight, but war is chaotic, full of human error, unforeseen events, and the fog of war. Assuming it's all predictable is, again, the ludic fallacy. Why do people fall into this trap? Sometimes it's about control. Rigid models can offer a false sense of stability. Other times it's a coping mechanism. Pretend life is a game, and the messy uncertainty fades away. And often, It's about simplifying complex issues to make them seem solvable. The danger? The ludic fallacy ignores the essential unpredictability of life. It leads to poor decisions built on shaky, oversimplified assumptions. It gives a false sense of security, preventing us from bracing for the unexpected and from truly engaging with the real-world complexity. So, how do you spot the ludic fallacy? Look for arguments that assume real-world situations can be neatly modeled like games. Watch out for claims that skip over unpredictable factors. Ask yourself, does this model really reflect the messiness of life? And if you do spot it, call it out gently. You could say, I understand that the mathematical model is useful, but it can't account for all the unpredictability in the stock market. Or, I see how game theory adds insight, but war is far more chaotic. Don't let polished models and neat predictions fool you. By challenging the ludic fallacy, you open the door to more grounded, honest conversations. You stay aware of the limits of simplified reasoning and make room for nuance. Because life isn't a game, and when we treat it like one, we risk losing our grasp on what truly matters: reality, in all its unpredictable complexity. Middle ground fallacy. Let's just meet in the middle, or there's truth on both sides. Sounds reasonable, right? But sometimes, settling for the middle ground isn't the best solution. That's where the middle ground fallacy comes in. This fallacy happens when someone argues that the compromise between two extremes is always the correct answer. It's the idea that the truth must lie somewhere in between. But just because something is in the middle doesn't mean it's right. Let's break it down. Imagine a debate about whether the Earth is flat or round. One person says it's flat, another says it's a perfect sphere. Someone committing the middle ground fallacy might conclude that the Earth must be a flat circle. But that's not true. The Earth is an oblate spheroid. The correct answer isn't in the middle, it's based on evidence. Another example, a politician proposes a 50% tax cut, and another suggests a 50% tax increase. Someone might say, let's just keep taxes the same. But that might not be the best choice either. The right policy depends on the economic context, not just picking a number halfway between two extremes. So why do people fall into this fallacy? Sometimes it's a way to avoid conflict. By suggesting a compromise, they seem reasonable. Other times, it's about simplifying complex issues, sidestepping the need for deep analysis. It can also be a way to appear neutral or unbiased. The problem is that this fallacy ignores the importance of evidence and critical thinking. Assuming both extremes are equally valid often isn't true. It can lead to bad decisions and poor outcomes. To spot a middle ground fallacy, look for arguments that assume compromise is automatically correct. Watch for people avoiding a deeper discussion of the actual merits of each side. Ask yourself, is the middle ground actually supported by evidence? If you hear this fallacy, call it out politely. You could say, I understand you're suggesting a compromise, but I don't think the middle ground is necessarily the best solution here. Or, I appreciate your attempt at neutrality, but we need to look at the evidence. By challenging middle ground fallacies, you foster more informed, rational discussions. You help steer conversations toward evidence-based thinking and avoid being misled by empty compromises. Remember, the middle ground isn't always the right ground. Moralistic fallacy. The moralistic fallacy is the mistake of assuming that because something ought to be a certain way, it is that way. It often shows up in statements like, if it feels right, it must be right, or good people just know this is true. These blur the line between reality and ideals, confusing how the world is with how we want it to be. It's a subtle but powerful twist, reshaping facts to fit moral desires. When someone believes the world operates according to their sense of right and wrong, they're essentially saying, the world works how I want it to. But reality doesn't bend to our wishes. Take, for example, the idea, everyone should be kind, so there's no such thing as truly evil people. While kindness is a noble ideal, it doesn't erase the fact that harmful actions and intentions exist. Here, someone is letting their desire for a better world override observable truths. Another case, the world should be fair, so everyone has an equal chance of success. Fairness is something we should pursue, but pretending that all starting points are equal ignores the deep structural inequalities that actually exist. Again, a moral belief is distorting the perception of facts. Why do people fall into the moralistic fallacy? Sometimes it's a way to avoid uncomfortable truths. Believing that the world aligns with our ideals can be comforting. It's easier than facing difficult realities. Other times, it's a defense mechanism. By claiming their actions are morally right, people can sidestep criticism. And often, it's just an emotional response dressed up as fact. The danger of this fallacy is that it clouds judgment. It creates unrealistic expectations and can lead to decisions that are disconnected from how things actually work. It keeps us from confronting and solving real-world problems because we're pretending they don't exist. So how do you spot it? Look for arguments that confuse what is with what should be. Notice when someone ignores evidence because it doesn't match their values. Ask, are they seeing the world as it is, or as they wish it to be? If you hear a moralistic fallacy, you don't need to be confrontational. You can say something like, I agree that kindness is important, but that doesn't mean evil doesn't exist. Or, I support fairness, but we can't ignore that not everyone starts from the same place. These responses affirm the ideal while still recognizing reality. In the end, ideals are important, but they don't define truth. Recognizing moralistic fallacies helps us stay grounded, make better decisions, and have more honest conversations. It's a step toward dealing with the world as it is, not just as we wish it to be. Appeal to tradition fallacy. Ever feel like tradition is being used to justify something without any real reason? That's the appeal to tradition, a tricky way to claim something is right simply because it's old. It works like this. Someone argues that a practice or belief is valid just because it has been around for a long time. They're essentially saying, it's old, so it must be good. But just because something is traditional doesn't automatically make it right or effective. Let's break it down. Imagine someone arguing against same-sex marriage. An appeal to tradition might sound like, marriage has always been between a man and a woman, so it should stay that way. While it's true that traditional marriage has historically been between a man and a woman, that doesn't mean it's the only valid form of marriage. Traditions can change as society evolves. Another example, someone arguing against using new technology in schools. An appeal to tradition might go, we've always taught students with textbooks, so we should continue to do so. Textbooks have been a traditional teaching tool, but that doesn't mean they're the most effective tool in today's world. Technology offers new and valuable learning opportunities. Why do people use the appeal to tradition? Sometimes it's a way to avoid change. By clinging to tradition, they avoid adapting to new circumstances. Other times, it's a way to create a sense of comfort and security by relying on familiar practices. It can also be used to assert authority. Claiming something is traditional can make it seem more legitimate. The problem with the appeal to tradition is that it ignores the importance of progress and innovation. It can lead to clinging to outdated practices and beliefs, preventing us from adapting to new challenges and opportunities. It avoids considering whether something is still useful. So, how do you spot an appeal to tradition? Look for arguments that claim something is valid simply because it's traditional. Pay attention to arguments that ignore the need for progress and change. Ask yourself, is the tradition still relevant and effective? If you spot an appeal to tradition, call it out politely. You might say, I understand that marriage has traditionally been between a man and a woman, but that doesn't mean same-sex marriage is invalid. Traditions can change. Or, I understand that we've traditionally used textbooks, but let's consider the potential benefits of using technology in schools. Don't let someone convince you with empty appeals to tradition. By challenging these appeals, you can foster more informed and progressive discussions. You can prioritize evaluating practices and beliefs based on their merits, not just their age. Remember, just because something is traditional doesn't automatically make it right or effective. By learning to identify and address appeals to tradition, you can make more informed decisions and avoid being misled by flawed reasoning. This helps create a more forward-thinking and adaptable dialogue where practices are evaluated based on their current value, not just their historical presence. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Ever seen someone cherry-pick data to fit their narrative? That's the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, a sneaky way of creating patterns where none exist. It's like this. Someone selects data points that support their claim while ignoring those that don't. They're essentially saying, "Look at this pattern I found," but conveniently ignoring all the data that doesn't fit. Imagine someone drawing a target on a barn wall after shooting a bunch of arrows. They then point to the cluster of arrows and say, "Look how accurate I am." But they've ignored all the arrows that missed the barn entirely. They're creating a pattern after the fact. Another example, someone claims a town is unlucky, pointing to all the car accidents that happened on a specific street, but they've ignored the other streets in the town where accidents also occurred. They're focusing on a specific area to create a false sense of pattern. Why do people use the Texas sharpshooter fallacy? Sometimes it's unintentional. They might genuinely be trying to find patterns in data, but they aren't being objective. Other times, it's a deliberate attempt to mislead by selectively choosing data that makes their claim more convincing. It's also a way to confirm existing biases. The problem with the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is that it ignores the importance of representative data. It can lead to inaccurate conclusions and misleading claims. It creates the illusion of patterns where there are none and avoids the need to consider all the evidence. So how do you spot a Texas sharpshooter fallacy? Look for arguments that selectively use data to support a claim. Pay attention to arguments that ignore data that contradicts the claim. Ask yourself if the person is considering all the relevant data. If you spot a Texas sharpshooter fallacy, call it out, politely, of course. Say something like, "I understand that there were accidents on that street, but we need to consider all the streets in the town to get a complete picture," or, "I understand that you're focusing on that cluster of arrows, but we need to consider all the arrows to assess your accuracy." Don't let someone convince you with selective data. By challenging Texas sharpshooter fallacies, you can have more accurate and objective discussions. You can focus on the actual evidence and avoid being misled by misleading patterns. Remember, data needs to be considered in its entirety. By learning to identify and address Texas sharpshooter fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and help create a more honest and objective dialogue, where claims are supported by representative data, not just selected points. Cherry-picking fallacy. The cherry-picking fallacy is when someone presents only the evidence that supports their point while ignoring any contradictory evidence. It's like showing a perfect picture but leaving out the pieces that don't fit. This can make weak arguments appear stronger than they really are. For example, imagine someone arguing that a certain diet is highly effective. They might highlight testimonials from people who lost weight and studies that seem to back up their claim. However, they conveniently leave out research showing that the diet might not work or could even be harmful. This selective presentation of evidence is a classic case of cherry-picking. Similarly, someone advocating for a particular political policy might present statistics and stories that make the policy look successful, while ignoring data that shows negative effects or harm done to others. In both cases, the person is focusing only on the evidence that supports their argument while disregarding anything that challenges it. Sometimes, people cherry-pick unintentionally because they want to find evidence that supports their beliefs without considering other perspectives. Other times, it's a deliberate attempt to mislead by selectively choosing evidence to make their argument seem stronger. Cherry-picking can also be a way of reinforcing personal biases by only acknowledging information that confirms pre-existing beliefs. The problem with cherry-picking is that it creates an incomplete and often misleading view of the issue. Ignoring counter-evidence leads to inaccurate conclusions and gives a false sense of certainty, making it harder to truly understand a situation. To avoid being misled, it's important to look for arguments that selectively use evidence and to be critical of claims that don't address the full range of relevant data. If you spot cherry-picking, ask questions to encourage a more balanced view, such as, I see the examples of people who lost weight, but are there studies that show it's ineffective or harmful? Or, I understand the statistics supporting the policy, but are there any that show negative consequences? By challenging cherry-picking, you can promote more honest, objective discussions where all the evidence is considered. Recognizing and addressing this fallacy helps ensure that decisions are based on a complete and accurate understanding, not just selected pieces of information. It's important to remember that evidence needs to be considered in its entirety to avoid misleading conclusions. By doing so, you can contribute to a more informed and rational dialogue, where claims are supported by all relevant evidence. Burden of proof fallacy. Ever heard statements like, it's up to you to show me it's not true? They sound confident, but might be hiding a logical dodge called the burden of proof fallacy. Here's how it works. Someone makes a claim, and instead of providing evidence to support it, they shift the responsibility to the other person to disprove it. Essentially, they're saying their claim is true unless you can prove it false. But that's not how logic works. The person making the claim has the burden of proof. Take this example. Someone says, there's a teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars. If you ask, how do you know? They might respond, prove to me there isn't. But proving a negative is impossible. You can't prove that something doesn't exist. The burden is on the person making the claim to provide evidence, not on you to disprove it. Now imagine someone claims that a new supplement will cure all diseases. If you ask, what evidence do you have? They might say, prove to me it doesn't. Again, the burden of proof lies with them to show that it works. So why do people use the burden of proof fallacy? Sometimes, it's a way to avoid providing evidence. When a claim is weak, shifting the responsibility onto someone else is a convenient dodge. Other times, it's a way to create a false sense of certainty. By demanding proof of the negative, they make their claims seem more credible. And sometimes, it's a way to shut down a conversation and avoid any real debate. The problem with this fallacy is that it ignores the basic principles of logic. The person making the claim must provide evidence, not the other person disprove it. If we accept claims without evidence, it leads to faulty conclusions. To spot a burden of proof fallacy, look for arguments that shift responsibility to disprove a claim. Pay attention to phrases like, prove me wrong, or it's up to you to show me. Ask yourself, is the person making the claim providing any supporting evidence? If you spot a burden of proof fallacy, call it out politely. You can say something like, I understand you believe there's a teapot orbiting the sun, but the burden of proof is on you to provide evidence, not on me to disprove it. Or, I understand you believe this supplement cures all diseases, but I'd like to see some evidence to support that claim. By challenging burden of proof fallacies, you can foster more logical and informed conversations. You'll be focusing on actual evidence and avoiding being swayed by irrelevant demands. Remember, the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. By identifying and addressing these fallacies, you can make more informed decisions and create a dialogue based on facts, not unsupported assertions. Personal incredulity fallacy. Personal incredulity is a fallacy where someone dismisses a claim simply because they can't believe it or understand it. It often shows up as statements like, I just can't believe it, so it must be wrong, or that's too complicated, it can't be true. It's a subtle way to reject something without engaging with it properly. Essentially, this fallacy occurs when someone rejects a claim simply because they find it difficult to grasp. They might say, I don't get it, so it's not real. But just because something is hard to understand doesn't make it false. Let's break this down. Imagine someone saying, I can't understand how evolution works, so it must be wrong. Evolution is a complex process, but that doesn't make it untrue. Scientific theories often involve intricate ideas that require time and effort to fully understand. By letting their lack of comprehension dictate their belief, the person is falling into the trap of personal incredulity. Here's another example. Someone might argue, the universe is too vast to have formed by chance, so there must be a creator. While it's true that the universe is enormous, that alone doesn't prove the existence of a creator. Science offers explanations for the universe's formation, even if they are difficult to fully grasp. The person's awe and confusion are replacing objective analysis with personal disbelief. So why do people use personal incredulity? Sometimes it's a way to avoid cognitive dissonance when confronted with information that challenges their worldview. Other times, it's a way to avoid intellectual effort. By claiming something is unbelievable, they avoid having to understand it. It can also be a way to express feeling overwhelmed by complex information. The problem with personal incredulity is that it disregards the importance of evidence and critical thinking. Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's false. Personal incredulity leads to dismissing valid claims based solely on personal limitations and creates a barrier to learning. To spot personal incredulity, look for arguments that reject claims just because they're hard to believe. Pay attention to arguments that ignore evidence and rely on feelings of disbelief. Ask yourself if a person's lack of understanding is a valid reason to dismiss a claim. If you spot personal incredulity, call it out, politely, of course. You could say, I understand that evolution is complex, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. Let's look at the scientific evidence. Or, I understand that the universe is vast, but that doesn't automatically prove a creator. Let's explore the scientific theories. By challenging personal incredulity, you keep the discussion focused on evidence and avoid being misled by flawed reasoning. Remember, your understanding doesn't determine reality. By learning to identify and address personal incredulity, you can make more informed decisions, foster open dialogue, and evaluate claims based on evidence rather than personal disbelief. But you do it too fallacy. Have you ever caught yourself or someone else using the phrase, but you do it too in an argument? It often sounds like a quick comeback, but it can hide a logical trap known as tu quoque, which is Latin for you too. This fallacy works as a deflection of criticism by pointing out the hypocrisy of the person making the argument. Essentially, when someone accuses you of something wrong, instead of addressing the accusation, you say, but you do it too. You're implying that their argument is invalid simply because they're guilty of the same thing. However, just because someone is a hypocrite doesn't mean their argument is wrong. Let's break it down with an example. Imagine someone criticizes you for eating unhealthy food. You might respond, but you eat junk food all the time. While their eating habits could be relevant to a discussion about healthy lifestyles, they don't invalidate their criticism of your diet. You're deflecting their criticism instead of addressing it. Consider another example. A politician criticizes their opponent for accepting donations from special interest groups. The opponent responds, but you accept donations from special interest groups too. Once again, both politicians might be guilty of the same practice, but this doesn't make the original criticism invalid. It simply means both parties might need to change their practices. Why do people use the tu quoque fallacy? Sometimes it's a way to avoid taking responsibility for their actions. When someone is caught doing something wrong, they might try to shift the blame by pointing out others' hypocrisy. Other times, it's used to shut down criticism by making the accuser look hypocritical, undermining their credibility. And sometimes it's just a knee-jerk reaction to feeling attacked. The problem with tu quoque is that it ignores the real issue at hand. It creates a false equivalence between the accuser and the accused, preventing productive discussions and making it difficult to resolve conflicts. The underlying message is, if you're not perfect, you can't criticize me. So, how can you spot a tu quoque fallacy? Look for arguments that deflect criticism by pointing out the hypocrisy of the accuser. Pay attention to arguments that avoid addressing the actual issue, and ask yourself whether the accuser's actions are relevant to the validity of their argument. If you spot a tu quoque fallacy, call it out politely. You could say something like, "I understand that you also eat junk food, but that doesn't change the fact that my diet could be healthier." Or, "I understand that you also accept donations from special interest groups, but that doesn't invalidate the criticism of my own donations." Don't let someone distract you from the real issue with tu quoque fallacies. By recognizing and addressing them, you can have more honest and productive conversations. You can focus on the actual issue and avoid being sidetracked by irrelevant accusations. Remember, just because someone is a hypocrite doesn't mean their argument is wrong. By learning to identify and address tu quoque fallacies, you can engage in more meaningful discussions and avoid being misled by deceptive tactics. You'll help foster a more focused and productive dialogue where the real issues are addressed. Psychologist's fallacy. Ever feel like someone is trying to explain away your views by claiming you're psychologically flawed? That's the psychologist's fallacy, a tricky way to dismiss arguments by suggesting they're merely psychological projections. It goes something like this. Someone assumes that because a person's beliefs or arguments might be influenced by psychological factors, they must be invalid. It's like saying, "You're just saying that because of your feelings." But just because psychological influences are present doesn't automatically make an argument false. Let's break it down. Imagine someone argues for stricter gun control. A person using the psychologist fallacy might respond, "You're just saying that because you have a fear of guns." While it's possible that the person's fear of guns influences their view, it doesn't automatically invalidate the argument. The argument should be evaluated on its merits, not just the speaker's possible psychological motivations. Take another example. Someone criticizes a politician's policies. Using the same fallacy, a person might say, "You're just projecting your own insecurities onto the politician." Again, even if the critic's insecurities influence their view, it doesn't invalidate the criticism of the policies. The criticism should be judged on its own, not on the critic's psychological background. Why do people use the psychologist's fallacy? Sometimes, it's a tactic to avoid engaging with the actual argument. By claiming someone is projecting their feelings, they can sidestep addressing the issue directly. Other times, it's used to create a sense of distrust, casting doubt on the person's credibility by implying they're psychologically flawed. In some cases, it's just an easy way to shut down a conversation without offering any real counterarguments. The problem with the psychologist's fallacy is that it overlooks the importance of evaluating arguments on their own merits. It leads to dismissing valid points based on irrelevant psychological motivations, creating a hostile environment for debate and hindering meaningful dialogue. It avoids addressing the substance of the argument. So how do you spot a psychologist's fallacy? Look for arguments that dismiss claims by labeling them as psychological projections. Pay attention to whether the person's psychological motivations are actually relevant to the validity of their argument. If you spot the fallacy, call it out politely. You could say, "I understand that my fear of guns might influence my views, but let's focus on the actual arguments for and against gun control." Or, "I understand that my insecurities might shape my criticism, but let's concentrate on the criticism of the politician's policies." Don't let someone undermine the discussion with irrelevant claims of psychological projection. By challenging psychologists' fallacies, you can foster more informed and focused discussions, ensuring that arguments are assessed based on their merits rather than the psychological motivations of the person presenting them. Remember, psychological influences don't automatically invalidate an argument. By learning to spot and address these fallacies, you help create a dialogue where arguments are evaluated for their substance, not their psychological context. Red herring fallacy. Have you ever been in a conversation where someone suddenly changed the subject just as you were about to make a strong point? Or maybe you've watched a debate where the participants seem to be talking past each other, addressing completely different topics. That's a classic example of a red herring fallacy. A red herring fallacy is when someone introduces an irrelevant topic into the conversation to divert attention away from the original issue, like tossing a smelly fish to distract from what really matters. It's essentially a way of saying, "Look over here. Don't worry about what we were just talking about." But just because the topic has shifted doesn't mean the original issue has disappeared. Let's break it down. Imagine you're discussing the need for stricter gun control. Someone responds, "But what about the mental health crisis? We need to address that too." Mental health is indeed an important issue, but it's not the same as gun control. The response shifts the conversation away from the original point. Classic red herring. Here's another example. You're talking about the high cost of college tuition, and someone says, "Well, students today are lazy. They just spend all their time on social media." While student behavior might be a topic worth exploring, it doesn't address the issue of rising tuition costs. Again, the subject has been changed to avoid the real debate. Why do people use red herrings? Sometimes it's to avoid answering a difficult question. When an argument is weak or uncomfortable, changing the topic can be a way to dodge accountability. Other times, it's a form of manipulation, introducing a topic the speaker feels more confident about, steering the discussion in a direction they can control. And occasionally, it's simply to confuse or distract the other person. The problem with red herrings is that they prevent productive conversations. They lead discussions off track, obscure the core issues, and make it difficult to reach a meaningful resolution. It's like creating a smoke screen. Everyone ends up talking, but no one addresses what really matters. So how can you spot a red herring fallacy? Pay attention to abrupt topic changes. Ask yourself if the new subject actually addresses the original point. If it doesn't, you might be dealing with a red herring. When that happens, call it out politely. Say something like, "I understand mental health is important, but let's stay focused on gun control," or, "I hear your concerns about student behavior, but we're discussing tuition costs right now." By identifying and challenging red herring fallacies, you can keep conversations focused and meaningful. You'll avoid being sidetracked by distractions and help create a dialogue where real issues are acknowledged and addressed, not avoided. Just remember, changing the subject doesn't make the original problem disappear.